So there's plenty of evidence of glyphosate's toxicity. The problem is that the government had approved glyphosate way back when, 1975 was when it was first introduced on the market. And, the FDA and the EPA, they all have their hands full with all these new chemicals coming out all the time. They think glyphosate's a done deal. Like, that's already been settled. It's non-toxic. The FDA started measuring glyphosate in food recently. Before that, they didn't care how much was in it, which is pretty surprising because it's the most common herbicide on the planet.
Welcome to the Wise Traditions Podcast, sponsored by the Weston A. Price Foundation for Wise Traditions in Food, Farming, and the Healing Arts. We are your source for scientific knowledge and traditional wisdom to help you achieve optimal health.
I'm your host, Hilda Labrada Gore. This is episode 61, and my guest is Stephanie Seneff. Stephanie is a senior research scientist at MIT's Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory in Massachusetts. She is a Bachelor of Science from MIT in Biology and a PhD in Electrical Engineering and Computer Science. In recent years, Stephanie has brought her brilliant mind to bear on the topic of toxic chemicals and their impact on our bodies. She has written over 30 peer-reviewed journal papers on the topic. On today's show, she speaks with us about the most commonly used herbicide in the United States, glyphosate, the active ingredient in the product Roundup. Stephanie reveals her concerns about its use, its prevalence in our food system, and how we may be able to avoid it. Before we begin our conversation, we want to take a moment to thank our sponsors. Wise Traditions is supported in part by Just Thrive Probiotic and Antioxidant, the probiotic everyone's talking about. Go to thriveprobiotic.com. And listeners like you. Seriously, did you know that the Weston A. Price Foundation is member-supported? No huge grants are keeping us going. You do. Please go to westonaprice.org and click on the donate button today. And thank you very much. Oh, and by the way, today's conversation was recorded at the Wise Traditions Conference in Montgomery, Alabama last fall. So don't be surprised if you hear the occasional train whistle or children at play in the background. Welcome to Wise Traditions, Stephanie.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
In the news, a lot of people say that Roundup is a bad product. Can you explain what it is and what are the active ingredients in it?
Roundup is the pervasive herbicide that's used extensively on the crops, especially the GMO Roundup Ready crops that are the core crops of the processed food industry. And it's also a herbicide that you can go to the local hardware store and buy it and use it to control the dandelions and other weeds in your yard. So a very, very convenient way to poison the weeds and keep them out of the yard. Its usage has gone up enormously in the last 2 decades in step with the enormous increase in the GMO Roundup crops. Part of that is because of development of glyphosate-resistant weeds, weeds that you have to add more and more of the chemical in order to kill the weeds. Glyphosate is the active ingredient in Roundup. Roundup also has other ingredients added as adjuvants that are and surfactants that are supposedly even more toxic than glyphosate itself as well. So the product is much more toxic than the individual chemical that is the active ingredient.
So like you said, we can just grab Roundup from the local hardware store and use it to get rid of weeds on our yard. But on a larger level, on an agricultural level, they are using it to spray tons of crops, but also aren't they like growing it inside of crops? Can you explain that?
Well, the problem is that the crops take up the glyphosate into their root system and get it throughout their tissues. And so it becomes embedded in the actual proteins of the crop, is what we think. So we're working on a theory about this. Myself and Anthony Samsel, who does research with me, we had the idea about almost a year ago. Anthony had the idea that glyphosate might be getting into proteins by mistake in place of the amino acid glycine. If this is true, it's absolutely huge because it means that glyphosate gets into proteins that makes them resistant to being broken down, and then as a consequence you develop immune reaction to them, and then you can get autoimmune disease as a consequence of that immune reaction. We have an epidemic in autoimmune disease today in America and increasingly worldwide, and I think it may be there may be a large contributing factor due to the glyphosate getting into the proteins by mistake.
Can you enumerate what those autoimmune diseases are that are on the rise?
Well, things like celiac disease, which is gluten intolerance, and of course we've got all the allergies, the peanut allergies and the casein allergies, allergies to milk, and then we have things like lupus, which is a pretty serious autoimmune disease. Your organs can get attacked. And then you have multiple sclerosis, you have autism, which I think is basically an autoimmune disease, irritable bowel syndrome, and type 1 diabetes, hypothyroidism due to Hashimoto's thyroiditis, which is an immune attack on your thyroid.
Now, some people would say, gosh, we're exposed to so many toxins. Why is everybody pointing the finger at glyphosate? Couldn't it be just a combination of factors that are affecting our health?
Yeah, in fact, everybody's not pointing the finger at glyphosate. Most people are saying glyphosate is more or less non-toxic to humans, and it's the most used herbicide on the planet, and especially used at high levels in the United States. And part of the reason why it enjoys so much usage is because of its claimed non-toxicity to humans. So, in fact, that's where the problem lies, because people think it's not toxic, and we're assured that it's not toxic by the government, and we think we should believe the government. And so most people don't believe that it's toxic. It's insidiously toxic in this way. I mean, this is what I think, is that if it's getting into the proteins by mistake, it all of a sudden explains the strong correlations that we're seeing between the rise in glyphosate usage and the rise in a huge list of all these diseases that I just mentioned. So, including cancers like thyroid cancer and pancreatic cancer, these are also probably a consequence of glyphosate's effects on these organs. And so the strong correlations that we see led me to say, how can it possibly be that one chemical could be causing all of these different diseases? Most people say, well, the correlation doesn't mean causation, forget this. And I don't say that. I say that there's a reason for that correlation. And the reason is causative, and the causative mechanism is this business of getting into the proteins by mistake in place of glycine. If it does that, then it can explain all of these diseases, because you can find individual proteins that are crucially dependent on specific glycines. And when those glycines are mutated into something else, say alanine, through a genetic mutation, then you get a certain disease. And that disease is one of the diseases that's going up in step with glyphosate. So it makes sense that instead what's happening is glyphosate is going in place of the glycine and causing that same disease by virtue of messing up that protein's ability to do its job.
Stephanie, that is amazing, and it's also very deep. What does this mean to us as consumers? Like, is there a way we can avoid glyphosate?
Organic food is really your best bet. It's not going to get 100% free of it, but it's going to have less. So we are very careful to buy only certified organic when we shop at the grocery store in my household. And I would encourage everybody listening to this to do the same. If you are eating GMO Roundup ready foods like the soy, so forget about soy protein bars, soy drinks. Those are really dangerous, I think. Anything containing derivatives of collagen, so gelatin, for example, because collagen is a very common protein in the body that has lots and lots of glycine. So what's happening, I believe, is that the glyphosate is substituting for that glycine, and is therefore you're going to find high concentrations of glyphosate in gelatin, which comes from collagen, which comes from cows and pigs that are fed heavy doses of glyphosate in their GMO Roundup ready feed.
Wow, so it comes not only in what we're eating, but what we're eating, what it eats.
Yes,
that sounded weird, but yes, you know what I mean. In other words, if the animals are feeding on food or grains that are coated with glyphosate, then that gets into our system as well.
Yeah, indirectly through their proteins. And of course, that makes you think, too, of gel caps, because gel caps are often the way you would get supplements. And so the gel caps are probably also contaminated with glyphosate. So you have to really start to think about even the pills you're taking and whether you need to find organic sources for those.
But you said right now there haven't been a lot of studies that show the causation, but you're on the trail for that, right?
There have been a lot of studies that have shown problems with glyphosate. Certainly in animal studies, they've shown that it disrupts, for example, the neural tube. So studies have shown that reasonably small doses of glyphosate can cause a disruption in the development of the head region, the brain of both chickens and amphibians like frogs. These studies have been done. Studies have shown that glyphosate causes cancer cells to proliferate when they're exposed to it at tiny, tiny levels of parts per trillion. Really tiny levels of glyphosate can cause cancer cells to grow in vitro. So you can suspect it might be connected to breast cancer. We've got an epidemic right now in breast cancer in premenopausal women. I suspect that's connected to glyphosate acting as an endocrine disruptor. We certainly have evidence that glyphosate chelates minerals, which is crucial because that messes up the supply of iron, zinc, manganese, all kinds of minerals that we require in small amounts that are really important for certain proteins to work properly. Glyphosate also has been shown to suppress cytochrome P450 enzymes in the liver, and those enzymes are crucial for detoxifying other toxic chemicals. So in the presence of glyphosate, everything else becomes much more toxic than it would otherwise be. So there's plenty of evidence of glyphosate's toxicity. The problem is that the government had approved glyphosate way back when, 1975 was when it was first introduced on the market. And, the FDA and the EPA, they all have their hands full with all these new chemicals coming out all the time. They think glyphosate's a done deal. Like, that's already been settled. It's non-toxic. We don't even have to measure it. The FDA started measuring glyphosate in food recently. Before that, they didn't care how much was in it, which is pretty surprising because it's the most common herbicide on the planet. And only recently they started measuring it. They found it was present in all the honeys that they tested, including organic honey. Just a couple of days ago, I saw an article that said that they've decided to abandon this effort. They're not going to continue to test glyphosate in food because they've had a lot of issues with the testing methods. So it's difficult to test for glyphosate, and I think that's partly because it's bound up in these proteins. So unless you use some kind of enzymes to break down the proteins, you won't see it. The testing methods will fail. So you'll get ambiguous, different conflicting results from different methods that you use. And then you're like, what's going on with this? I don't trust anything. The problem is you've got to break down that protein. It's very difficult to do. If the protein contains glyphosate, it makes it resist proteolysis. So you're kind of stuck because you won't be able to see it when you look for it, even though it's still there. And it's going to cause huge trouble.
But you're a scientist and you've seen enough evidence that you are alarmed. I think I told you I thought everyone was pointing their finger at Roundup and glyphosate as causing trouble, as toxic to us because I run in kind of organic foodie circles. But the general public is not alarmed because I guess they're taking the FDA and the EPA at their word, right?
That's right, exactly. We've been assured by the government that it's perfectly safe and that the levels are way below anything you'd need to worry about, and it's not a problem. And we're just being told that over and over again by the government and by the media. And so most people, they're just inclined to believe that and not worry about it. But when you look, to me, the evidence is really overwhelming. And things like Alzheimer's disease is going up dramatically, exactly in step with a dramatic rise in glyphosate usage. Autism is a perfect match. As I said, thyroid cancer, pancreatic cancer, these things are increasing alarmingly. And various autoimmune diseases like multiple sclerosis and ALS, which is a really serious, muscular skeletal paralysis. You really don't want to have ALS. That's also going up dramatically. And it's been shown, for example, that farmers in the Midwest have a significantly increased risk to ALS, the people who are working with the glyphosate on their farms. I can explain the ALS connection very well, and I've written a paper about that that's under review right now, through all these ways in which it would disrupt the glycines in multiple proteins that are all connected with ALS. It's quite a remarkable story. That's just one example. I think you can take each one of these diseases and you can go deep with it, and you can show exactly how glyphosate would cause the things that are associated with that disease and how that disease process would unfold if glyphosate is, in fact, going into these proteins by mistake. It's a very insidious, slowly developing problem that accumulates over time. So the glyphosate slowly gets more and more of it into your tissues, and it's very difficult to get it out once it gets into those proteins. So any protein containing glyphosate in it that can't be broken down becomes an opportunity for autoimmune disease. And so it's just a cascade problem. You might be fine for even 10 years, and you're gradually getting more and more buildup. And at some point, something really cracks, and then you start to get one of these awful diseases, like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's disease. These are not things that you want, And
no, goodness.
Eat organic food, and you will keep that away. I would hope that it would help to protect you from these really serious neurological diseases.
Have you seen any people who suddenly realized, I'm becoming sick with this autoimmune disorder, I'm going to clean up my diet, and have they seen health improvement, or is it kind of too late once you hit that tipping point?
I've had a lot of people share with me, particularly with autism, that when they put their autistic child on an organic diet, they saw marked improvements, even reversal of an autism diagnosis. I know someone personally who had serious psoriatic arthritis from psoriasis, and she was debilitated. She had to quit her job. She basically had to retire early. And she knew there was something with the food that was causing her problem. She tried different kinds of food eliminations, none of which really worked. And then she decided to do an experiment where she didn't eat for 3 days. And by starving herself, she saw that her symptoms were greatly improved if she starved. But she knew she couldn't just starve. She had to eat at some point. And then she said, well, let me just try organic. And when she did that, she got much better after 3 months of being on an organic diet.
Wow, that's fantastic. Well, what would you say to those who are in disbelief? Should they do a little test like this woman did almost? Well, I'm not saying they should starve themselves, but should they eliminate some foods and switch and see if they even feel a difference? Would they feel a difference?
Yeah, I think so. And I think it's not going to be immediate, but I think that pretty quickly, after probably a month of eating organic, you would start to see symptoms go away. I mean, I can actually give a personal testimony from myself because pretty much I frequently had problems with urinary tract infections, and it was getting to the point where it's kind of every year in the spring, sort of after the winter where the vitamin D's down, right, I would get a urinary tract infection. I always try to treat it with cranberry juice, and it never, ever worked. And finally I would go to the doctor and I'd get the drug, which I hate to take the antibiotics. I would take the antibiotic, it would solve the problem. I was always very grateful that it solved the problem and never caused anything serious. So phew about that. But once I switched to organic, which was about 3 or 4 years ago, I never got another urinary tract infection. It just completely disappeared. So that's just a small story, but I consider it significant.
Absolutely. And you said your husband had a health scare, right?
Mm-hmm.
And did you switch to organic after that?
His health scare was 9 years ago, the heart issue that he thought he was fine, and then he did a stress test, and he flunked the stress test, and they put him in. They considered it an emergency, and they put him in 2 days later, so we had no time to do any research. And he had a stent inserted in the blocked artery, and he was put on a hydrostatin, and we've talked about that before. And I immediately started doing research on heart disease and statin drugs. That's kind of where it all started with me 9 years ago. Became all over again a biologist. I have an undergraduate degree in biology, but I got really back into it after that with both the autism and the heart disease. And so he's been on an organic diet for 3 or 4 years now, and he had issues with tachycardia, which is an arrhythmia, and that has completely gone away. And I think that's because of the organic diet. And he feels very energetic, and he had some issues with back pain, which has also disappeared. So really pretty amazing. I think there's an epidemic in back pain these days, and I think that's probably an autoimmune attack on the spinal column. And I think that people with back pain would be very encouraged to go to an organic diet to try to fix that problem.
Stay tuned because Stephanie discusses what to do when glyphosate is nearly everywhere. And she even brings up at least one country where it has been banned altogether. Just now, we want to take a moment to thank our sponsors, Just Thrive Probiotic and Antioxidant. Research-based probiotic with human clinical trials on leaky gut, the first 100% spore-forming probiotic that arrives alive in the intestines naturally. It supports optimal gut health, digestive health, immune health, and delivers antioxidants. Great for adults, kids, the whole family. The probiotic everyone's talking about. Just Thrive Probiotic and Antioxidant. Visit their website at thriveprobiotic.com. And listeners like you, on iTunes, user 128-484-83 said, "This is the best health strategy I've found. Really love the Weston A. Price Foundation and their eating strategy. Compared to all the others I've read about, Atkins, Paleo, Primal, Bulletproof, etc., this seems to be the most grounded and sustainable. Really appreciate their focus on traditional food. Thanks, Wise Traditions, for your work getting sensible and wise nutritional advice out there." Thanks so much for the review. It means a lot to us and helps put us on other listeners' radar. If you haven't done so, please go on iTunes and rate and review the show. It's just one way you can help support the program. Thanks. And most of us are reactive instead of proactive about our health. Mm-hmm. But it sounds to me like if we do some investigative work and do some tests, we might find a way to stop these things before they even get started. Although it sounds like glyphosate is pretty much everywhere, and chances are it's in our system, right?
It's very hard to avoid, and it's probably in the water supply. It's in the rain. It's probably in the air, especially if you live near an agricultural area where they've got GMO Roundup ready crops. Very, very difficult to avoid. And so I can't say that organic diet is enough. I mean, I really worry about it. And of course, whenever we travel, whenever we go out to eat, it's very difficult to find an organic restaurant. So we cheat. We cheat when we're out, and we laugh about it. You know, we just kind of have a joke about eating the glyphosate and hoping that it's not going to cause any trouble. But you can't. It's very, very difficult in this country to stay away from that stuff. And of course, there's other chemicals as well. It's not just the glyphosate.
Well, and you said it's even in the air, which makes me think, just like they found that some organic honey had glyphosate, maybe some of our other organic produce and products has glyphosate unintentionally as well.
That's true. And in fact, I think there was an organic company that tested a variety of breads, including organic breads, and found glyphosate in the organic bread. Considerably less, but still present.
Stephanie, that is so alarming, because here we are at this Wise Traditions conference, and I know we're not the only ones, but many of us are trying to pursue good health and make the best choices for our family. And you're telling me that even if we do that, there still are traces of toxins in our food.
Right. It's really unfortunate. I'm hoping that there will be a future time when we recognize, when finally the government acknowledges that we have a huge problem and that they will promote sustainable organic agriculture. That's really what we need, not just for our own health, but also for the health of the earth, because the soil is getting ruined by the glyphosate as well. And that's also contributing to global warming, global climate change. So it's a factor in the climate change, I'm sure of it, that the glyphosate is causing these greenhouse gases to get released into the atmosphere instead of being fixated as organic matter in the soil, just by virtue of hurting the microbes in the soil.
Wow, that's interesting. I'd never heard that before. So another thought I had just now is, should we just all live somewhere else?
I know.
Seriously, are other parts of the world more serious about this? Are they using glyphosate too, or no?
Yeah, it's pretty pervasive over the world, but not everywhere. Sri Lanka, in fact, is a very interesting country that has banned glyphosate usage, period, for any usage inside that country, following an epidemic that they had in kidney failure among young agricultural workers in the rice paddies, where they were using glyphosate to control the weeds with the rice. And research was done, and they saw that the farmers that were working with the glyphosate were getting the kidney failure, and the ones over here that weren't working with glyphosate were not getting kidney failure. So that's how they figured out that it was the glyphosate that was causing it, and the government was completely proactive to say, okay, we're banning this stuff. I would love to see our government do that too, and of course there's no hope. I mean, our government is so comfortable with the chemical industry that they're just convinced that we have to have these GMO crops, and it's so wonderful that we make agriculture so cheap and so few people have to be involved with it. You know, people can go do technical jobs instead because we don't have to have so many people out there pulling weeds. You know, it sounds like a really good deal that you can grow food so cheaply, and then the food is actually, U.S. has the cheapest food relative to our income. We have the cheapest food in the world. And we have by far the most expensive health care. Those two are directly connected. I think the reason why, I hear all this talk about Obamacare and how we have to revoke it, and it's costing too much money. And I don't understand why there isn't a conversation politically about why are we so sick? Why is our health care so expensive? I mean, the reason is because there are so many people that are having so many issues that's requiring medical treatment that's just driving up our healthcare costs. So we need to fix that problem, and we can fix it by eating organic. So it seems simple to me. Put the people who are currently taking care of the sick people, put them to work pulling the weeds. Just basically change the model where you devote more effort to growing healthy food, and then you don't need as much effort in maintaining health because people are so sick.
It's like we were saying earlier, be proactive as opposed to reactive.
Yes, exactly.
Wow. Is there anyone in power that you can talk to about this?
I wish. We have gone, actually, a group of us went to the government and presented our information about glyphosate, including this idea of it incorporating into proteins by mistake. And we presented it to some congressional staffers in a meeting. And then we also presented it to the EPA. And it was a kind of a discouraging experience because they were clearly they were kind of putting up with us, but they weren't really listening to what we were saying. And there's been no reaction since then. They haven't done anything in response to our meeting.
Now, I know this is conjecture, but do you think it's because, like you said, they're overwhelmed with all these new chemicals in the market and they have to go through the process of approving or denying approval for their use in the marketplace? Is it that, or is it really that they are, like you said, too comfortable or entrenched with maybe even money flowing in from these companies that's influencing their decisions?
I think it's definitely the latter. I mean, I think there's just so much money that is available in these industries, the chemical industry, that's both the pharmaceutical industry and the agrochemical industry. Both of them know how to play the game to just make sure that people get richly rewarded for supporting an agenda that is on their side, and somehow that just prevents people from speaking up. I mean, it just prevents them from acting. I do not understand how the government officials can stand by and let this epidemic happen. Particularly, I see the damage to the children. It's so sad to see, of course, the autism rates going up exponentially, but things like even ADHD, attention deficit disorder, something like 10 or 12% of the population of children, and all the eczema and the asthma, all the food allergies, the peanut allergies, the gluten intolerance, all these problems. Type 1 diabetes is going up dramatically. I mean, Why isn't the government worried about this? If our children aren't healthy, our future's not healthy. And that's the way I feel. We just have to fix this problem.
Oh, yeah. If you go into a second grade classroom, you would be hard pressed to find one healthy child. Every child has issues, from problems with vision, simple little things like that, to more serious, being somewhere on a spectrum. It's really alarming. And I'm thinking, don't these officials have children?
I know. You would think that they would be touched by it in some personal way. I keep hoping that somebody really big in politics I don't want to wish that on somebody, but, to have a son or a grandson that develops autism, to make it personal. And then if they can just realize this is what's causing it, they would be much more passionate about trying to fix the problem, I think.
I think so too. So as we start to wrap up and swing back around to us as consumers, you suggested that we consume organic food that will protect our health and the health of our kids to the degree that that's possible. Is there anything else we can do to take a more active stance about this?
Yeah, well, I would hope that anybody listening to this believes what I'm saying and then wants to be proactive, make sure that their family know what they've learned, share their information with other people, their friends, their family, emphasize the importance of buying organic food, because that will drive the market towards organic. Even perhaps, if they've got a yard, try to grow organic food in their own yard, take ownership over their own food supply. It's possible that once enough people catch on to this, we're going to have a tremendous shortage in organic. So it's going to be a problem, I think, a crisis. I'm hoping that more and more people will become aware, and at some point we won't have this, the supply won't keep up with the demand. So that's going to be an issue. But if you are a farmer, switch to organic. That would be a great thing for you to do. It would protect your own health in the future and also offer such a great product for your customers.
It is a growing wave. I heard someone in agribusiness the other day saying that they were keeping their eye on the organic movement and they just had industrial agriculture monocrops out in the West somewhere. And I was surprised and pleased to hear them say that. Yes. Now, I don't know what it would look like under them. I understand organic producers of different crops also use pesticides, and I don't know if they use glyphosate, though. Do you?
They can't use glyphosate. It's not allowed, but you're right. They can use, I think, some organic pesticides that are naturally produced and things like that. So they don't just pull the weeds by hand, but I do think what they're using is much less toxic than glyphosate. I wanted to say that glyphosate, as I mentioned, the glyphosate-resistant weeds are causing a serious problem. There's going to become a point when it doesn't make sense anymore. They're spending a lot of extra money for these seeds that are protecting the plant against something the weeds are already resistant to anyway, so why would you bother? And now they're introducing new GMO seeds to provide protection against other herbicides that are at least as toxic as glyphosate, such as 2,4-D, which is a component of Agent Orange, which was used to defoliate Vietnam and had all kinds of issues with the health of the people that were exposed. So we're going to have new mixes of new herbicides coming along down the road with new kinds of diseases. I don't even know what to expect if we don't just change course to recognize that this whole method of agriculture is flawed and it cannot work. And if the sooner a farmer recognizes that and switches back to these more sustainable organic methods, then the better off we'll be. So I'm really hoping that there'll be a market motivation based both on the fact that the consumer wants the organic food and that their health will be protected if they don't use these chemicals, and that these chemicals aren't really working anyway, so why bother? So I'm hoping all of those factors together will be motivators to change the way we do agriculture, and that's really, really important.
Absolutely. So I often ask my guests at the end of the interview, if the listener could only do one thing to improve their health, what should that be? What would you recommend?
Organic diet. Definitely organic diet.
I had a feeling.
Yeah. I would say also, though, to eat a high-fat, high-cholesterol, high-sulfur diet, and to eat probiotics. Probiotics will help to heal the gut, and glyphosate disrupts the gut microbes. So those are some other recommendations in terms of the diet and the food.
That's great. Stephanie, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
My guest today was Stephanie Seneff. For a look at some of Stephanie's papers and presentations, go to people.csale.mit.edu/Seneff. Better yet, just go to the westinaprice.org website, click on the word podcast, and go to the show notes for episode 61. You'll find a list of highlights from the show and the link that we just mentioned.
If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it with others. Post a link on Facebook or Twitter, or send a link to a friend in an email, or simply review Wise Traditions on iTunes. Sharing the podcast is one way to spread the important message of health through nutrition. Wise Traditions is brought to you by the Weston A. Price Foundation for Wise Traditions in Food, Farming, and the Healing Arts. The content of this podcast is provided for informational purposes only and is not intended as a substitute for medical advice.